very much, Dr. Stockwell. I'm thrilled to be here. This is fun for me because I'm doing a little more administrative work these days. I still see patients a day a week. I'm still very much involved in our subspecialty training program and the like, and that's where I get my sustenance from, and because that's where I've learned everything, has been in the clinical settings as a developmental pediatrician working with children who have had something interfere with their neurodevelopment, and always there's behavioral components to that across the range. Obviously these days working a lot of children with autism, ADHD. My research and passions have been around attention and learning and then hearing impairment, and in recent years it's been very much focused on upstream from our clinic as to our responsibility as specialists in our field to really be intervening much earlier. And so I take that responsibility seriously, and I've enjoyed the opportunity to work with a number of you folks here as well. So Molly, we go back years, would help me grow. Chris on the board of Institute for Child Success, and heard so much about Dr. Booker, and I know all of you. I know your passion, your commitment, your energy to dedicate this time to participate in Surge, to learn, to change Spartanburg, and go there. Let's talk about something miraculous and amazing and wonderful and unbelievable, really, that any of us function normally. I mean, I always tell my patients, true, I mean, it is, and there are no perfect brains out there. We're all a balance of abnormalities, and in my work, what I really emphasize is sort of demystifying for the children who might be struggling in school or whatever, and say, hey, there is nobody who does everything great. We all specialize. I mean, we all have parts of our brain functions that are much better developed than others, and the ones who know directions or can't remember names like me. I'm just dreadful in that regard, so I'll apologize ahead of time for my learning disability if I see you and don't remember your name. I just smile at everybody when I'm out, so I don't offend some people. I might creep some others out. Hey, I'm old enough, so that's all right. So we're going to talk about just the amazing things that happen in the prenatally and then in the early years of brain development, particularly because that's where things are just absolutely flying. And we'll talk some about the influences we learned only too well, some of those traumatic and negative influences that can really put developing brains at risk. But amen to that last slide as well. We've got to be careful about not overgeneralizing or predicting outcomes. And I've been in this field long enough to know, you remember crack babies, the lost generation, all of that, then you find out, hey, no, it wasn't nearly as bad as that, and you don't write off a group for something that might have affected their brains early on, and there are individual personalities, individual temperaments, and there's stuff we don't know. I mean, working in my field is very humbling, because when you get into the brain, you might know the heart. It's a muscle and there's electricity runs through it and it contracts and pumps blood, through tubes, and it's complicated enough. But then you get up to the brain and we are only scratching the surface literally and learning all the time. There's research continuously, I mean, I even, of course, the dictum that you're born with all the neurons that you're ever going to have and you spend the rest of your life losing them. Yeah, some of that's true, but then, lo and behold, 10, 15 years ago, there are parts of the brain that are generating new neurons. They don't last as long, they don't function in the same way, but we can't hold, firmly to any absolute truth. And you know that from health research about what you should or shouldn't eat and how that keeps changing. So we'll talk about those influences, and particularly the opportunities. We've heard so much about the risks, and then finish with discussing all of our collective responsibility. I mean, you can sort of read these numbers, but if you really stop and think about them, it is unbelievable. It is unbelievable. 700 connections every second. Not in our brains, unfortunately, but those little babies that we're holding, the children that we're nurturing and raising, the opportunity for learning there, the risk for something being impeded and damaged and not going as it should. And then it's just, you can't even wrap your mind around the number of cells in our brain. I've been lucky, and you'll see me quoting various folk during this talk, because I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm a pediatrician and I love kids. And I've been lucky enough to interact with some brilliant people, from Jack Shonkoff on through Paul Dworkin and others that I might mention as we go along here. And one of those has been, for the last 5 years, we've had a neuropathologist, a smart state endowed chair, Manny Casanova, with us, who actually started the first brain bank at NIH. And he's studied a lot on autism. I'll show you one of his slides later. But he used a great analogy of, if you think of the brain and the number of neurons as being like all the trees in the Amazon. And you fly over that, there's a lot of them. But then the connections being the branches and the leaves. And that's where, there's some grasp of just the complexity. And again, to my earlier point, the fact that this develops as it does, and that we are able to be functional more or less in our day-to-day lives, is a miracle. It absolutely is. Whoopsie. So things happen fast, very fast in gestation, and obviously that's why there's such a focus on supporting moms during pregnancy and ensuring their health, and everything that we can do to help them maintain that optimal environment for this brain that's just developing at phenomenal rates, and just amazing. So that even by 3 weeks, this is a little baby here, and the forebrain is where a lot of the thinking and all of that, we'll talk about that later. Hindbrain, that's where that cerebellum is, where it comes from. Midbrain is more the cranial nerve nuclei and things like that. But you can see how rapidly that's developing, even between 3 and 7 weeks, so before people would know they're pregnant very often. And then I think the big difference that we see, 11 weeks is still pretty darn early, where that's just less than 3 months of gestation and pregnancy, how much has formed. But the big difference really is the outer layer, the cortex, and the fact that at this age, and then even on into pregnancy, it's still pretty smooth. And then by the time baby's born, we have all the wrinkles, the sulci and the gyri. And do you know the primary reason why it's all wrapped like that? Anybody take a shot? Can imagine how it increases the surface area. So you talk about shoreline and the lake and that, and all the little coves and bays and everything else. And so that's what's happening here, is you've got so much cortex packed into this head. And so that's where a lot of that later development, as I'll be talking about, is all of the development of the gray matter of the part of our brain where we think and process and do all of that in this wrinkled old brain that we have. And if you just look at the numbers here, at birth 350 grams, by a year of age 1,000 grams, adults 12 to 1,400. So there's so much of brain growth and development has happened by then. And we know even with head size and head circumference, it doesn't increase a whole lot. And that is a big reflection. Why our heads are growing because our brains are pushing the bones out. Maybe a small head, then that's very concerning to us that something's gone wrong in the process. And all of this is, developing from the different layers in the embryo, and the outside layer is called the ectoderm, and that's actually skin and brain develops from that, and that's where this folding occurs. This is 18 days, that's less than 3 weeks, and then all of the massive explosion of multiplying cells and the complexities all growing from there. And that's actually why for us as clinicians, we're looking, if we're evaluating children, at their skin as well as their neurological function, because there are some conditions where there's abnormalities on the skin. Well, and neurofibromatosis might be one of those, the elephant man syndrome, where they do have differences on that. So enough embryology. Well, no, we're not done with embryology. So this is the amazing thing. So that notochord folds over, and that's how our spinal cord forms, and then the top part of it is how the brain is forming and developing, and folds over on the spaces, as we call the ventricles in our brain. Children, if you have fluid on the brain or hydrocephalus, that's where there's blockage, and that would grow and need to be drained. But the multiplication of cells and then their migration out to where they should end up and what they should be doing, that happens from there radially or outwards. And it's just phenomenal. So this is the ventricular zone, that's the down here. And then there are these cells called glial cells. They're like the scaffolding. So they're another, they're a good part of the volume of our brain, but it's the neurons that do the work. But they wouldn't be able to do anything without these scaffolds that they literally climb up and work their way out. And all of it is programmed by genes. It's phenomenal that well over half of our genome is dedicated to brain development. And I don't know the exact number, I hesitate to say 80%, but it's certainly more than half. And there's some genes that literally work for a day, like these homeobox or Hox genes. They will have programmed a cell to go to a particular part of the brain, hop off the train at that point, and then establish themselves, differentiate themselves, and then make the connections and start working. And they might just turn on and off for a day. So when we think about influences, during pregnancy, and unfortunately, some of those infections that rubella and some of the other congenital things that where we can actually, you can see from brain development, it was interrupted at that point in time, and then there's one condition called lissencephaly where the brain actually remains smooth like that because this process was interrupted. But it's just, again, all of this is mind-boggling to think that, those little guys are all programmed and they know where they're heading to. And then, and they're programmed to differentiate it. I'm not going to spend any time on this, but that's the genes that are involved, reelin and other ones that are telling them, when to hop off and form one of the 6 layers of the cortex. That's the outer part of the brain. And then what type of cell they're going to be and what neurochemicals and what function they're going to have. Just amazing. So they get to where they were headed, and then they've got to establish relationships and connections, because on their own they're not going to be able to do much, and it's all the integration and the synthesis and the function that's the miracle of our brain function. So they have to connect, and then that's all mediated by genetic programming, there's these little guide cells that say, hey, I'm your friendly guide, I'll get you to the next neuron that you need to connect with. Just unbelievable stuff that's happening. So don't ask any questions in detail because I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm skimming over the surface actually here. But just unbelievable stuff that's going on in the connecting up of these cells. And it's happening in a sequence. And that gets back to some of Dr. Parker's presentation last night, and Dr. Stockwell alluded to it as well. So everything is so phenomenally programmed. It is just miraculous. So, and what's happening is, yes, the neurons that are making the most connections, because this is the rate of connection. This is not just development. So language development doesn't stop after the first year. It's actually the connections of the neurons in those parts of the brain. But certainly if you look at sort of survival, the vision and hearing areas are the ones that really are developing early, and that's where babies absolutely recognize their mom's voice long before they're born, and all that side of things, and then the amazing things that happen in visions that are there very soon after birth, continuing to develop very rapidly, and that's where I mentioned that I'm interested in hearing impairment, where it's so incumbent on us to be sure that there's not sensory deficits, because if they are, and you're not getting the input at the time all the connections are being made, then that's going to very much impede your language development or vision. And I'm sure you've seen in Biology 101 that if an eye is blocked off, then that part of the brain doesn't develop as much and the like. Language a little later, and then the sort of higher cognitive function, all of our problem solving, creative thinking, all of that, and I'll talk later about that because that goes on. And so yeah, most of this is slowing down. It doesn't stop, to Dr. Parker's point. It's not like you miss a critical step and you're done. There's always work to be done. There's always more learning, more development of the brain. It just takes a little more effort. Okay, so the neurons are all there. They've all laid out where they should be in the cortex or deeper in the brain, and they have work to do. And some of them have to communicate with more distant parts of the brain, or controlling our motor movement and getting all those senses from our periphery and our limbs up to the brain. And so that means some of those ganglia, the pyramidal cells, have very long connections because they're going way down through the spinal cord. And that would be a long way for that information to be transmitted if it was just going along the secondary road of the axon, the projection from the neuron here. And so that's where the myelination Dr. Parker was talking about plays such a key role. So this is like this insulation being laid down around the live wire of the axon. And what it does is speeds up. So instead of the message having to go all the way along the secondary road, it can hop from node to node to node. And that just is like the superhighway that gets things going. So, and that's very important then in parts, if you see something and you've got to associate it, and then the front part of your brain has to tell you what you should do in response to that amazing integration that's going on has to happen in a millisecond. We talked about fight and flight as well. You saw the snake and all of that. Didn't take too long to activate your hypothalamic pituitary axis there. But so, and that's the white matter, the deeper structures. If you look at brain scans and that, and there's more fluid in that, and that's actually helped us a lot in some of the studies of early brain development, even in looking at autism and connectivity and the like, special scans that can look at myelinated things. And that's the sort of thing that's happening in the brain, is these connections are being established. And they need to be working efficiently in order for us to be able to process information. And they are reinforced by appropriate positive learning experiences, stimulation, and the like. And so those highways get laid down there, connecting up all these amazing parts of the brain. This blow your mind here. But just really to realize that by the time a child is born, it's just pretty phenomenal what a complex organ is there, waiting to soak up all of the experiences that she or he will be exposed to over the course of their lifetime. But they're wired and they're ready to go. Not in a sophisticated way, but everything's there, and this is actually looking at the brain, from the right side, so that's the front, and so also vision all here in the occipital lobe at the back, and then a lot of that is called the association areas. We've got key parts of our brain that do particular, they're specialized to particular activities, but they're not going to do all that well if they're not able to integrate and associate with what they've been exposed to before. So if it was like Groundhog Day and every time you saw somebody, it was the first time you saw them, that would just take a lot more processing. So that's all of this, recognition and that's in the association areas in front of the parts of the brain. Here's the cerebellum. We always, for a long time, thought the cerebellum at the bottom here just coordinated all the messages coming down to the muscles and coordination and speed, but then have learned through the years, absolutely, when it comes to attention. That was something that was studied early on, and now with the new work that Dr. Parker was talking about as well, that it is sending messages up. So there is no one part of the brain that does one thing. Sometimes I get a little discouraged. People say, oh, it's all left brain or right brain or, whatever. It is way more complicated than that, and I won't get off on a diatribe of, some of the oversimplification and marketing that goes on about how you can rewire your brain. Just know it is complicated. And the more you peel that onion, the more complicated you realize it is. So, so you've got the vision on there. So this is the temporal on the right brain is more music and the like, and the other side of the brain is more language. So there are those differentiations. The left side does more with rapid sequences and the sort of stuff that you need to be able to do in language and quick problem solving. The right side of the brain is more about pattern recognition and music and the melodies and things that are a little where you have to appreciate a complex pattern, but it's presented to you over a period of time and maybe repetitively, say in a piece of music, whereas language is just phonemes is coming so fast and so much more challenging to be able to process and make sense of. And then you get to the sort of the more obvious things of the sensory part where all the messages come up. And this is that homunculus. You've seen that picture of the big body sort of wrapped over the brain and represented in different parts. The sensory side here, and then the motor on the front, between the frontal cortex and the parietal. Again, the interesting part of that is that a big part of the homunculus is related to, look, there's fingers, face, lips. And so we'll see, because that's where how complex it is to actually form a word from your lungs to your diaphragm to all of the stuff that has to happen in the, with the vocal cords in your mouth and everything else. Amazingly complex. Speech and language pathologists and therapists can do some great work there if that's not happening exactly as it should. And fine motor very much is associated with that. So if you're in learning, so often, we look at children. And even in writing, when you're writing, you're actually using a different part of your brain from putting Legos together. Just to, if you come across students who seem to be very adept fine motor-wise, but they can't write, it's because it's a different part of the brain. It's much closer to the language part that they're using to actually write. So, sorry, I do have a little attention problem. I could talk for days and weeks, and my wife will agree with a groan in that regard. And then you get up to the front, and this is our executive function. This is the CEO. This is the quarterback of the team. This is the conductor of the orchestra. This is the part that tells all of these other super specialized parts to do what they should when they should. And if the conductor falls asleep, it can get pretty chaotic. And there's lots of regulation that goes on from there as well. And it's pretty far away, so that's where all of that integration is just so critical to be, for an individual to be able to harness and focus and all of their energies on whatever they're meant to be doing at that point in time, and filter out distractions and decide, should I do it or not, because of the impulsivity. So of course this gets to all of the ADHD stuff that you know pretty well. So anyhow, it is complicated, it is phenomenal, it is integrated, and there's a lot of work to be done, to have this amazing organism function as optimally as it can. Couldn't do a presentation without my children. But again, it gets to temperament and individual variation as well. So my Brendan Kelly, and I guess he's not anymore, but so he's our oldest. He sort of arrived in the world and he's saying, "Are you really my mom? Should you be holding me that way? How are things going?" And guess what he grew up to be? He was either an engineer, but he's in finance in the end. And he's the one whose finances are much better shape than his parents, and he organizes and plans, and we would trust him with anything. And then Philip's the next little dude there who has the brain that just zips and zaps and has a weird sense of humor and loves music and phenomenal with words, and he's the attorney. And then there's our little force of nature who I was thinking of last night, Katie. When I first looked at her when she was born, it's like, oh my God, that is a powerful little being there. And I was right. Of course she's got me wrapped around her finger, but she really is incredible. And she's a school psychologist now, so, mess with her. Which is great. And then again, just, the amazing things that are going on. And, isn't that lovely image? And that's what we would hope for all children. They don't all have the privilege of experiencing life that way. So there's where our responsibility comes in. Okay, so you're born with that brain that has all of those parts there specialized to do what they should be doing. And then you've got to fine-tune them and mature them and have them functioning the way that they should be. And that's where that, the process I showed you of the neurons connecting. Yeah, when you're born, you've got a lot. By the year, you've got pretty much all of the neurons, but they've still got some connecting up to do, and that's where the opportunity is, that's where the risk is. And that's where the wonder of creation and and the plan of how brains develop is just phenomenal. Because by 18 months to 2 years, we have actually got twice as many connections as you need to function. So as an adult, there's fewer. You can just see how dense that is. So that's wild, So think, gosh, you are losing connections, but you don't want to have all of those connections because then it's just noise. And there is an unfortunate condition called Fragile X syndrome, which is actually the most common inherited cause of intellectual disability, and I follow a lot of children with that condition. They are phenomenal. They've got great sense of humor, amazing kids, but the sad thing is that the process, it's called apoptosis, is sort of programmed, again, genetically programmed for cells to die off. So this is part of the plan, is that you should be losing cells. Just as a complete aside, that's what keeps us from getting cancer, is that turning off of multiplying cells. But anyhow, neural apoptosis is there and it should happen. And if it doesn't, and so with these children with Fragile X, have way more connections than they should have. So it's like they're this house with satellite dishes everywhere, and all of this stimulation coming in, which makes them incredibly distractible, incredibly anxious and overstimulated and the like. So we don't want to have all of those connections. We want to have the right connections. We want to have them, use it or lose it. And that's where it's all about. What it's all about is reinforcing those functional, positive, developmental pathways and allowing the noise and the ones that are not that functional to die off. And this is one of Dr. Casanova's slides talking about, even that concept of, getting out on the powder and skiing and, early on you can go anywhere. But then once the tracks are formed, then it's harder to get out of them. You can. And I think that gets to plasticity as well. That yes, you've got those habits formed. We know all about habits and resolutions to change them, and how by this time of the year they're not doing too well. But anyhow, so that's what we want to see. And Dr. Parker showed that as well last night, where the functional pathways are solidified, reinforced, functioning efficiently, and then the other stuff is allowed to die off. And it doesn't stop till you're in your mid-20s. Probably later for boys, you wouldn't be surprised to hear that. But you also, it is so true that in fact the executive part, so this just shows sort of maturation. Again, this is the front part of the brain and the back, and the blue is just a schematic, well, it's probably more than schematic, but representing, where you have mature function, and you'll see it's this prefrontal right in the front, that executive. Wow, it's Promethean. I could be drawing all over these. Is where where full development doesn't really occur till mid-20s. Now, of course, there's variation. So there's very mature people at a younger age, but you take any average college student, you experience that. So those 18 and 19-year-olds coming in who really are not thinking past the next fraternity party or whatever, and then they get to the early 20s and it's like, whoa, there's a world out there, I've got some responsibility coming and the like. I say that the actuaries in insurance companies had this figured out long before neuroscientists, because if you're renting a car, they have to be 24, 25. So they've got good data to show how much trouble you can get into at a younger age, and it's just true. Actually, my Philip, the son who thinks all things, said, we probably shouldn't have people going to college till they're 25, but society's not set up that way. But so we have to help. So again, another one of those responsibilities of ours is recognizing that those brains are not yet fully matured. You can forgive them some, but they still need that scaffolding, because they really might have all of the brilliance and everything else, but the conductor of that orchestra is not on top of his or her game yet. And this is just schematically showing that's the part that goes out to third decade there. So it is in the 20s.
This is
yes, please.
Kind of a dumb question.
No questions.
When you say executive function, define that a little bit more.
I'm sorry, I just throw out all the terminology. Okay, so, and in fact, there's, the concept of executive dysfunction has been much better recognized now. So executive functions, previewing, so that, if there's a task, so previewing, planning, organizing, initiating, not procrastinating, actually getting started, inhibiting inappropriate responses, so that's that sort of impulsivity, that's, yeah, it's going to be better if I do this way, I shouldn't just jump in there. And then the biggie being monitoring. Am I still on track? Am I doing the right thing? and then acting on the monitoring and correcting course. And then another component that falls under the concept of executive functions is called working memory, and that's the ability to hold multiple pieces of information in memory at the same time. So if you asked to do 2 or 3 things, you know, go up to your room, choose, come down, do that. Now, overlaps heavily with ADHD. Yeah, they didn't even, might have heard the first instruction and then got distracted up there. So a lot of you know, this broad concept of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder really talks to executive function. It gets into the motor side a little more, the impulsivity and overactivity and the like. But those executive functions are absolutely critical, and it's critical. The other one that I didn't sort of mention is the umbrella to that is regulation. And that is what's happening there. So if you think about it, I said if you're planning a task, those are the steps you have to go through. But if you presented with a problem, with a challenge, that's a part of your brain that should say, wow, is this a real threat? You know, should I run out in the road, or should I just, you know, call my husband to come and kill the snake, or, you know, all of that. And your frontal lobe doesn't work so well when you're absolutely overwhelmed in a panicky situation. But it's the sort of thing that reasoning, and it is all of that maturity. And it was under-recognized a lot for years and years. But there's a lot, any of you, you know, in education, I mean, there's so much work on sort of executive functions, and the earlier you do that, the better. There's no magic cure. I mean, a lot of what we as adults can do for our children is just model it. Okay, we've got this to do. What should we do first? Yeah. How's your frontal lobe? Not to pick on you, Chris.
We don't have the time.
No, yeah, that's right. As I've gone zipping off on different byways along the way here as well. So, you know, so doing that, say, okay, let's get the stuff. What are we going to need if we're cooking, if we're doing whatever? And that's what working memory is like. My old boss, Dr. Malavine, used to talk about mental counter space. So if you're cooking, you need all those ingredients, but you're not using them right at that point in time. They have to be available to you to use. So any task that you're doing. So number one, it's something that's a developmental process. Number two is that there are people that have, you know, less well-developed executive function and particularly working memory. So they're the ones that need to make lists, need to break tasks down into subsections, need to be given one instruction at a time and all of that.
And one of the things you'll find, schools are really trying to teach kids these functions now. So, you know, Kathy enjoyed, for example, when the Meeting Street pathways. So teaching empathy and, you know, grit, those sorts of things. So, because those things can be taught. Absolutely.
And that sort of self-regulation can be modeled, and it can become a habit as well.
Yes.
So there's a lot now in preschool, and then the mindfulness and type of work as well. I mean, I just love teachers.
It's amazing how much life trajectories already locked in by the mid-20s.
Yeah.
And people are labeling themselves and others about their capacity before the brain has had a chance to.
Yeah, we could have a long discussion about that. And with zero tolerance, some lives are totally ruined, you know, by an impulsive action. And I know that there's some even in legislation looking at 18, but shouldn't you have this middle group of 18 to 24 or 5 who you should give them a little slack, or at least treat a little differently from fully mature adults, because it hasn't happened at 18, it really hasn't happened at 21. So long way to go there. I don't think they should wait till 25 to start college, but well, you could keep them in school. But yeah, you're absolutely right, and I think we have to, you know, we have to be cognizant of that. We have to set up that scaffolding and that framework for our children and our students to you know, limit the risk, but you can't. They're learning by experience, so they have to, you know, have some hard knocks along the way. They have to, you know, back to stress as you're talking about. You know, we all need positive stress, and we all need to be a little anxious. Otherwise, we just it doesn't matter about that test and that. But it's tricky, and it's happening. But it can be laid down early, and that's where just those whole models. Preschool teachers, we have a program called LEN. It's sort of a interprofessional leadership thing in neurodevelopmental disabilities. We had school psychologists, and they were talking about a little program, and I bet you guys, there's probably nothing original about this, but what they had done for the little guys that would blow, it might be just their wiring, it might be because of experiences in their lived environment. But the ones who would really just, they'd painted feet on the ground, say, okay, you're getting really upset. Sit in this chair, put your feet on these, and then just push all of those feelings down into the floor. Beautiful sort of neurofeedback and control. And just for them to have those little strategies early on. And that is absolutely strengthening and facilitating frontal lobe development from an early stage. Now we're getting down to neuroanatomy. So this is Manny Casanova's slide. Don't worry about this, but this is actually from the cortex. So all those neurons that went up and layered, and then they're all connecting, and then they're sending messages down to the brain to do all sorts of stuff. And it is very, very complicated. So that's where the cells are. That's sort of the neuroanatomy. Then you get to the physiology. How do they function? And you know that it's all electrical impulses, but the electrical impulses at those connections trigger the release of the neurochemicals, the adrenalins and the dopamines and the serotonins and everything else. And there are cells that are specialized to do different things. And this is his work was in autism, what he described these mini columns, which is superhighways from the outside of the cortex down as you're responding and doing stuff. And in autism, those are packed closer together, so those youngsters will overreact to details but not do a good job of connecting in a social setting and the like. But anyhow, it happens that, and this is the big deal here, some of these cells are excitatory and some are inhibitory. Talked about the frontal lobe doing a lot of that inhibition and the like, but it's playing out at the micro level everywhere in our brain, this sort of balance. And there are other cells, these basket cells and others, that he uses the analogy of a shower curtain, that all of the stuff's happening, but it has to be some semi-shielded from the other cells, otherwise everything just goes wacky, like if you didn't have the curtain on the shower and then the water's everywhere. And that can malfunction, and the miracle is the balance, the regulation. A lot of that driven from the frontal lobe, but a lot of that's happening and a lot of that's wired in and inherent. There's 9:30, I think. Yeah, yell at me if I always talk too much, but I think we're okay. So this is how, so optimal function is somewhere between inhibition and excitation. So, and this is oversimplifying, but if if the excitatory part, which is glutamine and glutamate and those cells that do a lot with that neurotransmitter, then you're just everything that's there from, just wired to, and sadly in some of the psychiatric disorders, manic and just can't slow down. And some of those children with Fragile X are talking about live in that world, unfortunately. And then at the other end, for whatever reason, so it's healthy to be able to sleep at times and to be awake and the like, but you don't want to be absolutely disconnected. Some of it can be, in response to a traumatic event, that part of the brain is sort of overacting as well. And most of the time we hope to be somewhere in the middle. What are the influences? So obvious ones, physical health. So I already alluded to like congenital infections or meningitis or, there's so many, and just chronic disease can just zap and take from, because there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of nutrition, a lot of stuff, all those cells developing and growing, and myelin that's a fatty sheath, that's where you need the omega-3s, and you need that balanced diet because it really is going into the development of the brain and the fine-tuning of the brain, and anything that interrupts that from a physical health standpoint, from a nutrition, sleep, just so critical, that. Talk about attention and executive function, that's probably the best treatment. First treatment is to be sure these guys are getting adequate sleep. And then stimulation. Talked about vision and hearing already. Obviously, we talked about play last night. The ability to have a safe environment to explore, to learn, to make mistakes, to learn about gravity as you drop things, to learn, if you drop enough, you can train your mom to pay attention to you and pick them up if she's not paying enough attention. And then this is what we'll be talking a little more about, nurturing relationships, again, just strengthening those pathways. Disrupts genetics. So yes, I mentioned already some, and so there are well-recognized genetic disorders that disrupt brain development. There's any number of those that, in my world, we have to be trying to diagnose. Is that the case? Was there exposure to, opioids or whatever, alcohol prenatally was there, that infection was there, shaken baby. Prematurity is not great. I mean, we're doing so much better nowadays, but certainly, you know, if you're born into the world when all of those are not in place, then, and you can see the rate of development that's occurring. So babies that are born, you know, 28, 30 weeks, born 10 weeks early, there's a lot of that stuff still happening, and now it's in an environment that's much less secure and nurturing than the womb, the uterus. Neglect, toxic stress, yes.
What's serve and return? What's that concept?
We'll talk about that. I'll show you a video, in fact. Yeah, so yeah, that's a term that Jack Sharkoff said. And you'll have seen some, I haven't been acknowledging, but some of these slides are from him. And again, this is probably more complex in ETV, but we've been talking about this. So the relationships, physical, chemical, built environments, that's some of what I've been alluding to. Nutrition, interacting with genes, and then there are cumulative effects over time. There are some sensitive periods that we need to be in, early childhood being absolutely one of those. Then you're adapting, you know, physiologically, and then you've got your outcomes, behavior, education, achievement, physical, mental health. It's a complex balance, a very complex balance. Then you get to epigenetics. Dr. Parker talked about that some last night, and so some really interesting early studies like with rats, you know, so little baby rats that were some stayed with biological mother, some, you know, with a non-biological mom, and how did they turn out depending on what the mothers were doing. If they gave low maternal care, weren't doing the licking, nurturing, feeding, their pups ended up being overreacting to stress. And that really changed their glucocorticoid receptors. I'll talk about that more in a second. And that's not genetic, that's that actual. And you know, the behavior came from the foster mom, not the biologic mother, can go across generations, and that's the scary part. But again, always open to change. Don't worry about this too much, because epigenetics is something that we're really learning a lot about. Think, hey, now we know the genome, that's phenomenal. But what we don't know in the genome is all the parts of the genome that haven't been identified as actually, you know, programming. And what the genes do is program the cells to develop the proteins, which are the tissues, and the functions and the chemicals, and how we all, and that all comes out of your little chromosome, and then you explode that out to a little double helix, and then within that are these little the nucleotides, and they're all packed in, and that's how you know, that's the genetic component you're born with. But influences can change how those genes express, how they actually function. And that's where there's like some little markers that hormones, stress hormones, cortisol, glucocorticoids, the things that are released when you're stressed, they can actually act on markers and sort of unfold things that were previously not available to act and change the milieu and the function of the tissue, and now that changes. And then that's a sort of a permanent change that can be transmitted down through generations. This is just another sort of, yeah.
How does it get I mean,
so that's what your gene looks like after it's been, for you growing up, and then, you know, your genetic structure has altered some, and it's, and this is where the ice is getting thinner and thinner, so I'm going to be getting out of my depth here. But then, yes, so then the gene is actually, you know, functionally changed, and then in the next generation, that functionally changed gene can be transmitted and inherited by the next. And it's functioning differently from what the original blueprint might have been. Hopefully that's, it's complicated, way complicated, but it's very critical as well. Okay, we saw some of this picture last night. How do we react to stress? So I showed you the outer part of the brain and all the amazing stuff the cortex does, and then deeper in is the limbic lobe, and these are the drivers of what the rest of the brain does, and there's the amygdala and hippocampus. The thalamus is like the station. It's where all of the sensory stuff just comes through the thalamus, and it's the way, you know, it's the junction that sends messages off elsewhere, and then the hypothalamus is right under it, and it really drives things like the adrenal glands and the pituitary and all of the hormones. And then there's the old frontal lobe, which is very much linked into all of this. Don't want to get into too much detail in this, but again, hippocampus, site of learning and memory. amygdala side of anxiety and fear. They're next to each other, and it's that sort of balance that's critical. So, again, in an animal model, probably mice or rats or whatever, showing that if those animals were stressed, there was less of that activity in the hippocampus, which is the protective, so they didn't have that negative feedback, and then HPA axis, that's all the adrenal stuff, that's the fight and flight stuff. And the amygdala, the same thing, upregulation, accentuated, overactive axis there. This is maybe, hopefully, a little easier, but this just, again, shows what's happening. SSNRs, safe, stable, nurturing relationships. Talked about stability last night. So that's what it's all about. That's the magic. And that's what really can change the glucocorticoid, the release of the cortisol and all of those that can disrupt things. And if you're in those stable relationships, that's much less likely to happen to you. So if you don't have those, the amygdala is overactive. We talked about this last night, impulsive aggressive behaviors. The prefrontal cortex, that's the executive function, and the hippocampus, they're not able to function as well to do the reflecting, the adapting, the planning, and the deciding. Oopsie. And likewise, if you're in that positive environment, your prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, those pathways are better developed. So when you're faced with stress, you're more likely to say, okay, maybe that wasn't so bad. Bruce Perry's a psychiatrist. It was like 25 years before even Jack Shonkoff's stuff. Moderated a talk that he gave. And he's talking about children in inner city. Where was he? It might have been Chicago. It was a big city. And they were actually measuring heart rate. And they say, these children in the classroom, exposed to a sound that could have been a car backfiring or a gunshot. Both sets of children, heart rates just up. The children who've been exposed to stress stayed up for hours. Children who, again, that's that sort of tolerable stress, because then the others were able to bring their heart rate back down fast. And that's the sort of thing that's happening here, because the children in the nurturing ones, that probably was a car, or if it wasn't, then mom and dad will be here to protect me and everything will be fine. So pretty wild. Safe, stable, nurture, and preventing that toxic stress. Those are the keys. Those are the antidotes. And not only in the electrophysiological response, but even in the structure of the brain. You've probably seen this slide before, Dr. Harry Chugani, just showing his children raised in wherever it was in Eastern Europe and very neglected situations. This is a functional MRI, so this is where you're looking at blood flow and rates of metabolism and where the activity is occurring in a healthy child. This is the back. This is a slice from above looking down, so that's the front of the brain, that's the back. Those are the sides. Frontal lobe, again, executive functions. Look at the difference there in those children. And that's absolutely, that's a pretty old study. In the day, that's been 20 years maybe. Check this out. Talk about serve and return. This is serve and return.
In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, They react with negative emotions. They turn away. They feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here.
So, one observation, still face might be what your face looks like when you're on your smartphone. And you've seen that. Moms, parents and the kids are trying to get their attention. So it's not just abusive relationships. So that's not to say we can't be using our smartphones, but I think, I would love to see, little text messages pop up from parents as well, like, hey, have you interacted in the last minute or two if you're on Facebook too long or whatever. In fact, so just a complete aside, we have a conference every year, had 14 years. Jack Shonkoff was first speaker at it. We've had great guys through the years, and those are the people I've learned from. And actually, in a few weeks, we've got Dr. Barry Zuckerman, who actually created Reach Out and Read and Medical Legal. Amazing guy. He's a giant. He's one of my many heroes in our developmental behavioral peds field, but he's doing a lot now. His next thing is lower income parents, but or environments that might be at risk of really using technology and using that technology in a positive way. But it is pretty scary. It was a pediatrician we were talking and said, I've just been thinking, and I tell my parents, just watch this. It's on YouTube. Just look at still face. Ed Tronick is the psychologist up in Boston who did that work, and that's old work, but it's so true. And you guys have probably seen this viral video. Just humor me because I just love this little guy.
They need to work on that, right? Yes, okay. Did you understand it though? No. Okay. All right. Huh? Oh, no, not this one. This is the grand finale of this. Yeah, that's the last one. That's what I was wondering. I don't know what they're gonna do next season because they did some stuff this time. Exactly what I was thinking. Oh yeah. Right, don't bring that again. You know what I'm saying? Don't do the same stuff. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, I was thinking that. Yeah. Like go somewhere else with that, but don't bring it here. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. That's what I said. And then it was like, you know what I'm saying? And I was like, what in the world? But don't do that here. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Really? I thought the same thing. We think a lot alike, huh? Oh, that's crazy. Right.
No words, but how much language? That is just so awesome. What a great dad. And again, it's all of that, and that's, that could be a perfect instructional thing. Yeah, you don't just throw out the screens because that's part of our lives. And we've got to figure out how to use them and interacting together. So great. Okay, you guys know that you wouldn't be doing Surge if you didn't believe this. And again, what we've been talking about, so malleability and the ability to be influenced by experiences is so much, it takes such little effort early on, and then it's harder, but it's not impossible. And that's the amount of effort is going up. And that matches the Heckman curve. So, at a time where we should be investing so much, it's happening later where the return on investment, it's there, but it's just a lot more that needs to be invested for less return. And this is it. So I'm not going to belabor this. We've got 10 minutes, but those are the keys, and you guys are going to be, you're doing this already. Sam's doing this. This is just awesome. And your community's doing this because it has to all be happening together. That's Peter Gorski. He's just an amazing guy, a colleague who's down in Miami. And this is Dr. Neil Halfon, who's out at UCLA. He's done phenomenal work as well with Dr. Shonkoff, with Paul Dworkin and the like. And so this is just laying out these trajectories. So that should be a normal, healthy trajectory. Children at risk, and then those who are actually delayed or disordered, going out through at least those first 5 years. And those are the things that push you down. And these are the health promoting: parental education, emotional health, health literacy, early literacy, appropriate discipline, modeling executive functions, say. Keep it healthy, early childhood education. So that's pretty cool. I did a presentation to the, whatever it was, the state early childhood panel, and not to badmouth secretaries of education, but whoever it was back then, and it's not the current one, said, "You scientists, this isn't science," you know. So I said, "No, it's a schematic." You know, he made his point that we just, you know, skew data. But anyhow, enough of that. So Janice Grindell, who's just a phenomenal, you know, from Yale. She's done work here, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, you know, and so she's such a proponent of 2Gen, and of course we have to do that. If that dad was depressed and not present, he wouldn't be doing the phenomenal stuff he's doing with his little guy. He wasn't comfortable if they didn't have a place to sit and that was warm and safe. So it is about everything, and you don't need me to rather leave time for questions. But you've probably even seen this slide, or you have it, or it might be in the SAM literature. But we have to be looking at everything. Obviously, I'm focusing here so much on this, and then we're into through the educational years. Got to have that strong family, and they've got to be workforce. And this is the Center for the Study of Social Policy, phenomenal. Are you guys familiar with that? So it's in Washington. There's another colleague, Dr. Dave Willis. He's just great. He was in charge of maternal home visiting and in the Mental Health Bureau for years. He was in Oregon there, and now he's with the Center for the Study of Social Policy, another friend and mentor. But, you know, their whole deal is the protective factors. You know, our critical responsibility to support and strengthen families, and the way, you know, and all of the components that we need to be addressing, from education, domestic violence, children's mental health, home visiting programs, child welfare, family resource centers, targeted special needs, physical health, screening, assessment, early intervention, early education. It's got a cross-sector, and that, you know, that's what we need to be aspiring to. And for the protective factors are great. It's sort of like, yeah, having some knowledge and understanding of a child's development. When we do developmental screening, it's as much about parents understanding what their child generally should be doing at that age. There's variation. And that can help, because some parents might have unrealistic expectations. God, they should be able to do this or that, and get angry if they can't. But no, maybe they're not developmentally ready, or maybe they're lagging. There's something you need to address. And then, you know, you look at, okay, what can you be doing to promote your child's development? If your child's lagging, where should you go? You know, you go for help. We did this with the Pride program years ago. Duke Endowment funded us some, you know, getting out to parents and early educators and physicians, really, you know, around pushing how important that is. So parents' understanding of their development, parents' connectedness, again, all this stuff, you know, having a support system, you know, feeling good about themselves as well, and then that sense of competence. These are, you know, you've seen Maslow's hierarchy, and obviously from the basics of, you know, hunger, sleep, security, safety, and then connecting, love and belonging, need for friends, need to achieve, need to know, explore, and understand. So that goes back to the 40s, and then America's Promise, same sort of thing, healthy start, safe places, caring adults, opportunities to contribute, effective education, and then this is, CDs don't ask me that, because I borrowed this from Dr. Andy Gardner, who headed up the AAP's Early Brain and Child Development Initiative, but it was pretty cool. So again, the same thing, entering school healthy, learning in a physically and emotionally safe environment, having access to caring adults, opportunities to demonstrate achievement, actively engaged in learning, and that's where it's at. You know, and again, thanks to Peter Gorski, shared this in a talk, so that's the core. That little guy with his dad, he felt all of those, right? And he can't even talk yet. And that little baby, even younger, was like, hey, mom's not connected. But then she was able to get her attention back. And you're not the people in that end of the boat, right? Because we're all in it together. You're down here doing the good work. So thank you very much for your attention.